Good afternoon, everyone. Oops. Yeah, okay, we're live. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Francis, and I'm an associate professor in the departments of both political science and law, societies, and justice at the University of Washington. I am the moderator for today's event. It is the last of 4 webinars in WISIR's webinar series on contemporary race and politics in the United States. The topic today is teaching the movement. This should be an exciting discussion as there is plenty to talk about. First, I want to make an acknowledgement that we are on the stolen land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish peoples, past and present, and we honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. Second, I want to acknowledge the work of students, staff, and faculty involved in efforts to remove cops from the University of Washington. The efforts of many different organizations have congealed in the group Decriminalize UW, which is focused on divesting from policing. And as we head into Abolition May, I want to name this as one of many connected struggles on college campuses where people are working to remove police and create safer learning communities. Third, I would like to welcome our esteemed panelists and all of the attendees, including UW alumni, students, and faculty, and community members across the country. Thank you so much for spending part of your afternoon with us today in virtual community. So I wanted to provide a little bit of background about how this panel idea has developed. There have been many panels on important issues that many of us have participated in or tuned into, some about protest, policing, and racial justice. But I wanted to break away a little bit from that and have a reflection or a type of mediation on teaching. The intertwined social movements around labor, immigration, and Black Lives Matter and voting rights of the last year created this beautiful period where many people committed themselves to a period of reflection and learning about this nation's history, about struggles for justice, about their own accountability. And for some, it was about new concepts such as abolition and defund. For me, it was clear that the game has changed, that something so powerful happened that demanded a rethinking of everything in our lives. My teaching and research agendas could not just be business as usual, not when I was asking other people and other colleagues to change, but change to what and how to do it in a way that was in relationship with people and movements and not extractive of them. The 3 individuals who are assembled here teach and engage in community with such care. And I'm going to ask them a few questions about how they do what they do. I'm so grateful to our panelists for providing space for this conversation, and I invite you all to reflect with us. Our panelists today are Professors Amna Akbar from The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, Barbara Ransby, professor in history, gender, and women's studies and African American studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And we have Nikkita Oliver. They are a professor at Seattle University Law School, executive director at Creative Justice, and are currently running for position 9 in the Seattle City Council. I have learned so much from all 3 panelists, and their writings and ways of being in this world have influenced so much of how I show up. We are very lucky to have them with us today. So the format that we're going to be using today is that there will be 35 minutes of discussion between myself and the panelists, followed by questions from the audience. Please submit your questions using, what is this, the Q&A function? Yeah, the Q&A function on this webinar. All right, so let's go ahead and begin. So I'm always interested in a type of origins story about how people come to be who they are and what influences them. And I'm curious here about the teaching journey of each of the 3 panelists. I'm also very much interested in the long Black freedom movement, the long Black freedom struggle, and how it's centered in the research and teaching of all the panelists. And so my ask for this panel, for the panelists here is, can you speak about your teaching journey? How did this come to be? Why is it important for you to engage in the historical and contemporary work of Black activists in the way that you do? What has been helpful in that journey? Can I maybe start with Barbara and then do Amna and then Nikkita.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Megan, and your colleagues for assembling us. It's always great and exciting and stimulating being in conversation with you, and certainly I'm happy to be a part of this panel because of the work that Nikkita and Amna do. My teaching journey, I thought about that question, and I guess I want to go back a long way for me, which is to say I grew up in a household with parents who never went to high school, with grandparents who became literate as adults, and they were very smart people, and people of enormous integrity and curiosity, and generosity in terms of sharing knowledge. So I think those of us who make our living working in the academy have to approach our teaching work and our research work with humility and with the understanding that where we're located are not the only sites of knowledge production and learning and teaching. And in fact, some of the most stimulating intellectual spaces that I've been in the course of my life have been outside the university, right? Where it wasn't about tuition and grades and tenure and all these other kinds of things that the institution sort of imposes on the exchange of ideas. I would say probably the most intellectually challenging teaching and learning space was in the Free South Africa movement, where I had comrades from Southern Africa, some of whom had been students, some of them whom were in Umkhonto we Sizwe, which had been the military wing of the ANC and had been removed from their families for long periods of time. But they were reading, they were learning, they were asking questions. And I think, in the context of my own teaching inside and outside the classroom, I think of, I'm talking a lot now, but I think of listening as being really an important thing that teachers have to remember. What are the questions being asked? What is the wisdom being shared? How do we connect the dots between wisdom that's being shared and our own experiences? So, I mean, those are some of the flashpoints I think about. I also think as a teacher, who's not in my classroom every fall, right? It's the people who make their way to university by one way or another. People like me sort of beat the odds, if you will. Many people from the neighborhood I grew up in, never went to college, let alone, and they couldn't figure out why was I in school so long, like, can't you just get a job like everybody is? You're like in school for 20 years. But remembering that we do our work in places that actually police the validation of knowledge, that many people are excluded. Many of us have made a principal point of teaching in spaces outside the campus. Like, we have a project here in Chicago called the Prison Neighborhood Arts Program, and a number of us have taught in Stateville Prison. But folks who are incarcerated, the young people who are incarcerated, I think those are people who should be, my teachers and my students, right? Those are people who should be in our classroom. So I think my approach to teaching is much about the structures and contexts in which we teach and learn as much as it is the pedagogy itself. The other thing I'll say is just a little bit about epistemology. The way we get trained in the academy is, that you study this thing and then you become an expert at it, and then you get validation for being that expert, and then you share that expertise with other people. There's many ways to learn and engage the world. That is, epistemologies or theories of knowledge across the world and across time vary. In many communities and communities that I grew up in, your closeness to a subject enhances your sense of authority to speak about it, right? Whereas in the academy, your distance from a subject actually enhances your ability to speak about it, right? If you have too many subjective connections or investments, you're assumed to be biased. So anyway, that's some of what I carry with me. I think a lot about my many years of working on Ella Baker and what a movement teacher she was, without credentials, without certainly without a PhD and all of that. And her message, when she was when people talked to her about being a movement teacher, she said, I spent my whole life trying not to be a teacher, because being a teacher meant you had to conform to middle class respectability, and I didn't want to do that. So she became a teacher on her own terms. And I think that's what we, can and should all aspire to be. Was that adequate answer for you?
That was excellent.
Okay.
I just
Well, when I
really,
started going back 40 years, you started to worry, right? Like, wait, this can take a long time.
no, you did it too. You did it. You gave us the full arc.
I skipped a couple decades.
No, that was really excellent. Just really also appreciated the especially the points about proximity to the topic in the academy and outside of the academy, and who is viewed as a teacher, and then weaving it through the lessons from Ella Baker's life. Yes, thank you. Amna?
Okay, so I'm inspired by Barbara. I'm going to go a little bit further back than I planned. I think a core part of my childhood experience that leads to my teaching is that I grew up in a Pakistani immigrant Muslim household. I went to a largely white public high school, and then I attended a mosque that was started by Black Muslims, and at the time that I was growing up was kind of like half Black, half Desi. And so one of the things that happened as a result of that is that I kind of confronted the many different narratives that were being told to kind of narrate a particular moment in very different ways. So at school, I would get a particular set of stories. At home, during my mother's nightly ritual of watching the evening news, especially when the evening news was talking about the world, she would always be talking back and correcting things that they were saying, especially about the global South. And then at the mosque on Fridays, when the imam would be giving the khutbah, often the histories and stories of the civil rights movement, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, would be kind of like coming up at the mosque at that time. And the civil rights movement, for example, was something I learned virtually nothing about in my school. And so because of that, I was always really intrigued by how people in such close proximity to each other can be telling very different kinds of stories, recalling different histories, rooting themselves in very many different traditions. And so then fast forward to when I moved to Ohio, and I'm teaching at a law school. By this point, I'd become a scholar of policing, and in particular was focused on the policing of communities, of Muslim communities after 9/11. And Darren Wilson kills Michael Brown in Ferguson, and the Ferguson uprising happens. And here in Ohio, like all over the country, there were solidarity protests. And we also had a local campaign in solidarity with John Crawford, who was a young Black man killed in a Walmart here. There was this one particularly memorable protest that happened just a couple miles or maybe even a mile away from the law school, where people were talking about police violence. And again, I was really struck at that protest by how policing and police violence and state violence are constructed in the law school by and large, and how a mile away at this park, people at that particular protest, mostly Black organizers and multi-generational Black people from the local community, were talking about the long history of state violence against Black people and long traditions of resistance. And so that movement moment, those protests, those kind of different stories at that time kind of pulled me into wanting to think more about both the Black freedom struggle, but also to think about how when we root in freedom struggles, how that changes not just the object of critique, but its purpose, that it's not just to understand the problems of society, but to be rooted in a desire to change things. And so organizing, I think one thing that's kind of very similar about organizing and teaching is that they're both about telling stories. And I think for those of us who are kind of committed to racial justice work, I think there's a question or like an ambition, at least for me, about trying to create spaces within the classroom and in the university where we have the freedom to tell the stories, do the reading that we need to do to root ourselves and our students in the struggles of our time and in past struggles. And one of the things that's been interesting now that I've been doing this for a while is how as the moment changes, the relationship between the students and the struggle changes. So I remember when I started teaching about, the civil rights movement and the New Left back in 2014, most of my students were not involved in Black Lives Matter or local protests. And so kind of we were doing this teaching to kind of give them some history. Then with time, my students now, for example, last summer, we're on the streets and are organizing and involved in mutual aid networks. And so now sometimes the teaching and the learning doesn't just happen within the university, but in the organizing meetings or on the streets. And so I think kind of being attentive to that is important. And then I guess the last thing I'll say, just to echo something Barbara said, is just that I think teaching and learning are co-constitutive. And I think when we're trying to teach with our students and in relation to movement with a purpose of building a better world, part of that is embracing the collective kind of process. And so it's not about staying in one particular mode or any kind of particular kind of construction of knowledge or expertise, and both being invested in a kind of collective project of learning, teaching in order to kind of deepen our study and our struggle.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Amna. Nikkita?
Well, I don't even know what to add to all of that brilliance. Also, my internet just dropped, so I switched rooms. Welcome to life in COVID, and hoping that the internet does not drop again. My name is Nikkita Oliver. I use they, them pronouns, and I live here in the coastal Salish territories on Duwamish land. And, I really think of teaching, or my experience as an educator, really is a journey of learning. I was born and raised in Indianapolis, Indiana, in a family that is honestly not very political. And the extent of my knowledge of politics was very single issue. In the 2004 election, which was the first election I was able to vote in, I voted on strictly one issue, and it was abortion. And I was attending Seattle Pacific University, and the environment I was in was very much affirming of voting in that way. And so to my own shame, I voted for Bush in 2004. And lucky for me, I know everybody's shocked. Lucky for me, my ballot actually did not count because I was voting as a mail-in ballot. And so maybe that was the universe saving me from myself. But I share that because I think folks often believe that organizers and activists, abolitionists we're born this way. Like I was just born to fight the power and to talk about a world beyond prisons and police. And to be quite frank, I unlearned, I have unlearned, I'm still unlearning a lot of things. The water that we have all been born into and raised in has given us particular values. And the water that I was born in was very religious, in particular Christian, in the Midwest, and a lot of limited access to information about certain things. And while my schools that I attended as a young person, the public schools I attended, were not necessarily predominantly white, they were very conservative. And, I really grew up in a place where burning books is kind of a thing, which is probably why I'm very much a book hoarder now. I have a whole library of revolutionary texts because I kind of live in fear that these books will be taken away from me. But I very much, believe that being an educator is so much more about being willing to learn. And I remember when I got to Seattle Pacific University, they were getting ready to open the John M. Perkins Center that was focusing on economic development and leadership development. And Dr. Perkins told a story in kind of the opening chapel. He said that there was a group of researchers that went into a community that everyone viewed as being impoverished and having a lot of issues. And so the researchers kind of viewed themselves as coming in and providing some support. And so they do all this research, they come up with a list of things that they think the community needs to do differently. And they take that list back to the community, and they offer their institutions resources to kind of institute some new programs and to eliminate this list of problems. And the community says that the rat problem was too low on the list, that it really should be the first thing that you deal with. And the researchers are kind of like, they're mind boggled. They're like, we don't know what to do with this. And the community just keeps advocating for themselves, saying the first thing we want to deal with, the thing we need to deal with is the rat problem. And luckily these researchers listened and they supported the community in being able to address that problem. A majority of the list ends up disappearing. And so that story has always really formed the way that I think about not just learning, but praxis. Like, how do we take what we learn and what we know, what we unlearn? How do we put those things into practice? And like in the context of being a community organizer, really listening to those that have proximity to the struggle, because within the world of academia, or very like white supremacist academia, we treat those who have proximity to struggle as if they are the cause of that struggle, and or maybe aren't smart enough to deal with that struggle, and completely ignore the fact that so much of what's happening is systemic and has been enforced, oppressed upon people. And that story always reminds me that when I'm in spaces, that I need to be listening for the solution from those who have proximity to the struggle, and then be in partnership, allyship, accomplishment in solving whatever is at the root of what's causing that struggle. And as an educator, as an organizer, as an artist, that's really how I approach all of the work that I participate in, is from that position of believing that those who have proximity have the answers. And also just knowing, like, no one is born like this. And there is a multitude of knowledge bases and knowledge that we can be a part of. One of the like first most important things I ever engaged in like my formal education at the College of Ed at the University of Washington was a class called Theories of Knowledge. And the professor started out our first class by telling us a native story about how the trees and the plants committed to take our pain if we committed to being good stewards of the land. And if you connect that then to what we know in Western science, trees breathe in CO2 and breathe out oxygen. Humans breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2. If you're having a rough time or things are going badly and you go put yourself in the midst of trees and plants, ultimately that oxygen, that extra oxygen being around living things is actually going to like help you feel better. And that was just a moment that really helped me realize that there is so much knowledge, there is so much to know, there is so much to learn, and so much opportunity to see our communities of knowledge and learning intersect. And that has also really laid the foundation for how I view my role as like a community activist, educator, organizer, is that there's much more than this quote unquote formal knowledge system we've been taught. And in fact, this formal knowledge system is created to gatekeep and prevent people from having access to the wealth of knowledge bases that exist that could actually improve just the quality of life for everyone. And in the long run would lay a much deeper, wider foundation for the movements and revolution that we want to build, when we're open to the idea or the understanding that there are stories and knowledge all around us that come from so many different people. So I consider myself an unlearner and a learner in my educational process and as an educator, which I think often in the classroom puts, me as the professor and the students on an even playing field, which is often not what the ivory tower does. It makes the professor the authority, the educator. But I really view the opportunity to teach as creating a container for a learning environment. We are a learning community together. We all bring different knowledge bases, and we get to build something over the course of a class.
I mean, man, this is just already, I want to be like, but I also just hear, there's more questions, everyone, that we're going to get to. But I just want to pause for a moment on this focus of unlearning. I think for so many of us, especially people who have been trained, all of us in terms of went to graduate school, there's a specific way in which so many of us have been taught. And then later on, there has been a process of unlearning that is connected to a different process of learning. And then this idea here, which is a truth, that there is so much knowledge out of the formal systems, and how are we listening and in community to those who have proximity to the struggle, I think are just such important things to hold. Okay, I'm going to move now to directed questions for each of the panelists. It strikes me that each of the three panelists have created something different in the respective institutions or in their communities, or trying to push disciplines or the academy or community to think differently about an issue that some people think that they know well. And so at first I want to go to Professor Ransby to talk about something that is a light, it feels like for me, as a Black woman scholar in the social sciences, which is Scholars for Social Justice. And it's kind of the very formation, right? The focus on reimagining the academy and viewing campuses as important sites of contestation. And I remember when I like first heard about the group and I was like, what? There's a group that is like this and like, this is a starting point. So that was really exciting for me. But if you could just talk a little bit about that, I think that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Megan. So Scholars for Social Justice, first of all, I think there are all kinds of informal networks of scholars and then some other formal networks of scholars and academics who are pushing back against the embedded racism and heteropatriarchy and imperialism, Islamophobia in the academy. And Scholars for Social Justice is maybe one of the more recent iterations, and certainly my whole career has been trying to do this work, both outside, be a part of and in service to movements as an organizer, but also then to minimize harm and create oases for a different kind of intellectual work, inside the academy. But Scholars for Social Justice is deliberately outside of the academy. It is a group of academic scholars, researchers, independent scholars, Kathy Cohen, myself, Sarah Haley at UCLA, Dale Gore, Adam Getachew, Devarian Baldwin, and others. And it came together and began to figure out what would a membership organization look like, in which we learn from each other, collaborate, figure out how to be more than a sum total of our parts in service to movements, and at the same time confronting and interrogating aspects of the increasing neoliberalization of our universities, which includes policing, racism, et cetera. One of our early campaigns was to begin debates and conversations about the issue of reparations and harm that universities have done historically to Black communities. We are also, I should say, people of color led organization. And this is not, again, it's not work we put on our vitas, right? This is on our own time, which is also to push back against the ways in which universities try to control us 24/7. Like, it is a job. It is not my life. So we can play political roles and take political stances on our own time. And of course, people have been censured for that at different points. So we're very aware of that. But it kind of emerged at that moment of many of us were doing work around Ferguson and in service to Movement for Black Lives. But then there was also stuff going on campuses, the situation at Georgetown, the scandal that emerged that the Jesuit priests had, essentially sold 272 enslaved people to pay off a debt on a building on campus. UVA, Harvard, Craig Wilder's book about the legacy of slavery and Ivy League institutions. All of this was happening. So it became a question of how do we expose and confront some of the fallacies about the academy's narrative about itself, right? We also have held discussions and forums around the myth of meritocracy. At this moment in particular, it's a way in which, and we all collaborate in it in some ways. I mean, we resist as outsiders inside, but this fiction that, some young people have a test score that is, whatever, and somebody has a test score that's 2 points off, and this is a smart kid, and this is not a smart kid, and this is a kid that gets to go to college, this is a kid that doesn't. That even participating in the ranking and sorting of young people who want an education, is a part of the problem. So anyway, so really interrogating some of the very foundations of the university, but also being very much in conversation in service to movements that are in motion. So we've had, briefings and teach-ins and workshops and so forth with many movement organizations. Right now, we're supporting the Cops Off Campus Coalition and Abolition May, which your campus is involved in. And yeah, that's a little bit of what we do. We have different ways that people can become members. They can look up social justice, Scholars for Social Justice. I think it's .org, and there are you can either participate as a contributing member, or you can propose projects that then we will try to. We are pretty much self-funded. We've gotten a couple small grants, and then we've also contributed ourselves. So I mark that because there's so many controversies about how things are funded these days. But the other issue that we've talked a lot about and very supportive of is a campaign against student debt that the Debt Collective and others are leading, and a way to demystify labor on university campuses. So many universities are large employers with medical schools. We on our campus, I walked the picket line with my coworkers who were on strike here recently. But then the whole hierarchy with adjunct laborers, and then the majority of people of color on our campuses are often in working in grounds and housekeeping and so forth. And all of our academic training is not to see them as our coworkers, right? Because of the hierarchy of the university. So how do we break that down and expose the racism and elitism, in that, and begin to shift who we see as our academic community? So anyway, all of these are our tasks, and we just, trying to find our people. So, the other thing I think too is, of course, we're not trained to be organizers. We're trained to work in our cubicles and our silos, disciplinary silos, institutional silos, brand the next best, theory, or publish the next best book, and you get some perks. But how do we really practice collective thinking and collaboration and organizing beyond the training that we get as academics? And so we are doing our best to rehearse that and learn from others. So it's an important project, I think.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Ransby. Professor Oliver, coming to you next here. I'm hoping that you can say a bit about creative justice. I don't think I've told you this before, so I heard about it before I knew about the organization, in part because of some work with people in the Seattle community, and they had said that this was an organization that really worked with young people through a form of art, as well as learning, in terms of this, and also to set them on a different path, but also to work with the system and to a different type of narrative. And it was a way that really centered young people. And I just found it so interesting. So I was wondering if you could, as well as if there is perhaps time, the Seattle University Abolition course. I just also want to say, before I turn the virtual floor over to you, it strikes me as somebody who was born and raised in Seattle and has moved back now, that you are one of the city's, says unstable.
You're still here,
back?
don't worry.
Okay, I was like, no, I was about to give a reflection here. But it strikes me that you are, I feel like, an incredible, I feel like, organizer and teacher for so many in this community, that no matter what space you show up in, you help reframe a type of conversation for people in our community. So yeah, just wondering if you could talk maybe just about a little bit about your work here.
Yeah, and a lot of that reframing honestly comes from spending so much time building and developing alongside young people. Youth are not, as socialized into the patterns that often we become as we grow older, whether that's capitalism or expectations in educational or educational or employment environments. Young people just kind of see things beyond that possibility. And I think that gives me both the boldness and probably the ability to reframe things. And creative justice has been a huge part of that. We started originally as a diversion program to provide healing engaged spaces for young people through art, and quickly saw the ways in which the institution, in particular the criminal legal system, will do everything it can to kind of make you an arm of it. And creative justice was birthed out of the No New Youth Jail movement, which began in 2012 to push back against the building of a new juvenile courts and jail here in King County, which we were not able to defeat it being built but over an 8-year period, created such a powerful movement that just last summer, Dow Constantine, the county executive, said that by 2025, they'll shut down and repurpose that facility, which would not have happened but for the movement of young people in community really educating us about the problem of prisons and the harm and impact that prisons have upon Black, Brown, Native communities. And ultimately, young people leading the way on us dismantling the school to prison pipeline. So Creative Justice, while still being a supportive organization around providing young people with mitigation as they survive the criminal punishment system, has in some ways distanced a bit in order to be able to hold the line on abolition, of saying that this is not the way in which we want our communities engaged, and doing that often through an arts practice. You can say things through art that if you say it through words, people might not want to hear or listen to. You could tell them we want to abolish prisons and police and build this different world in words, and people will question everything you've said. But if you do it through a painting or a spoken word piece or through a song, people might be actually willing to sit through it and engage it. And it does something to people's hearts. And to tell the story of the experience of being through something like the juvenile criminal punishment system in art also really does help people who don't know anything about that system or have an experience with it to understand how incredibly damaging it is. So Creative Justice really has become a platform for speaking truth to power, for young people to build arts community. We pay all of the youth. Our youth sit on our hiring committees. They have weighted votes. They're a part of our board. They make decisions about how the organization evolves. Like, do we move from this fiscal sponsor to this fiscal sponsor, or do we become our own 501c3? Young people are 100% a part of that process, and what they say carries more than anything I say. Because at the end of the day, if Creative Justice cannot actually follow the idea that those who have proximity to struggle also have the solution, then the things that we're saying kind of ring hollow. So it is an experiment and doing our best to live what we say. And I won't pretend like we get it perfect every time, but it really has been an incredible opportunity to be a space for learning and education, but also to hold the line around abolition in our region as it relates to the criminal punishment system, which has also opened the door for me to get to teach this class at the Seattle University's School of Law about abolition, which is kind of wild. I'm literally getting to sit in a learning community with lawyers about maybe kind of like getting rid of our jobs and evolving, like, how do we think about this system that we're living in? And at the same time, I won't lie, I feel kind of guilty teaching in a university about something that I want everyone to have access to. So in partnership with other community organizers, I've started taking the curriculum that I originally developed for law students and just posting it online. Like, here's videos, here's podcasts, here's articles. Like, if you want to think about Abolition 101 in a 15-week series with your community, like, here's a way to access that. And I think it's really been an opportunity to kind of crack open this idea that you need to pay $200,000 a year and get this legal education to get to engage conversations around abolition. Because ultimately what a professor is for is to be able to have the time to read the materials and then bring it back to you and say, this might be a material you want to engage. Why can't we as folks in academia be doing that in a way that's accessible for community? And if COVID has taught us anything, whether it's Zoom, online resources, or other means of engaging with communities, we can make our curriculums accessible. And I know that that flies in the face of capitalism, right? Because as academics, we have a hold on the environment to discuss these hot topic issues and get paid for it, right? And I'm not going to pretend like an adjunct, like I'm making $1 million. I'm definitely not. But, like, finding ways to break open the container that says you have to pay for this knowledge, or you have to be this person to be worthy of this knowledge, and just creating spaces that are more accessible to people, and getting to kind of experiment on law students about how to talk about these issues has really opened the door to expand the movement that has already existed in the Seattle King County region for multiple decades around talking about a world beyond prisons and police, and giving people the language to do it. That's what shifts culture. Often people want to change the culture around us, but we don't know how to talk about it. We don't have the words to imagine it. And I think both artists and academics have the opportunity to share both the vision and the language so we can manifest a world that is beyond the punitive and oppressive systems that we live in now.
Great, excellent. I'm going to move to Professor Akbar here. I want to invite you to say a bit more about movement law as a type of methodology. This is something that has developed much more, and I believe in a forthcoming law review in the Stanford Law Review. But I was wondering, hoping that you could say a bit more about what that might look like, what that entails, because I think that it strikes me that in different conversations that I've had with some political scientists, but more law professors, that they're very much interested in this, but it's like a different way of like teaching and researching in law schools.
Yeah, so I want to respond briefly to what Professor Oliver was saying, just because this is like so much good stuff on the table, it's hard to just move on. But briefly, like, I think part of what they were bringing up is in terms of thinking about all of the different ways that movements and organizing and organizers and campaigns and resistance projects build knowledge and education and learning spaces is so important. Like political education, as I'm sure most people know in this space, has been such a big push in movement spaces historically, but also especially I would say in the last few years. Or if you think about efforts like participatory defense, right? So these efforts to kind of bring communities together around these isolating processes, whether it's contesting evictions or contesting criminal prosecutions, democratizing access to law and legal tools. Like, I think all of these things are important. And it's like, I think one thing that's important important to name is that for me, really central to all of my learning and teaching and shifting is to be actively participating in movement spaces and to show up fully there. Like, I think Professor Francis, at the beginning, you were saying something about, like, how do we mitigate concerns about extraction or not be extractive? And I think that's a contradiction that I try to hold all the time. But one of the ways that I, try to address that is by, in the ways that Professor Ransby was kind of suggesting, is like, I hoard parts of my time so that I can do other kinds of work. And then that feeds into teaching and scholarship. Okay, so Movement Law is an article that I wrote with two friends of mine and comrades, Jocelyn Simonson and Samir Ashar. Actually just got published today, which is exciting. So it's out in the world. But basically, it's this. It's like one of the things that I think Professor Oliver was just saying is that the work of movements is partly left movements, abolitionist movements, is to build another world through returning power and resources to the people. And part of that is about building a counter hegemony, a kind of different ideological edifice to make sense of the world as we see it and the world we want to build. And obviously, because of the pandemic, because of the George Floyd uprisings, because of all of the gorgeous and kind of organizing and movement building of the last 10 years, we're living in a moment where the neoliberal consensus is kind of more vulnerable. And so there's as movements and organizers are contesting the world as it is and imagining an alternative world, we as people who are paid and who have jobs in the academy, I think who feel aligned with movements, have to think about what can we do in our spaces with our students in solidarity with staff to kind of help build that other world. And so anyways, there's a lot I could say about this, but the movement law piece is basically designed to think about both to identify a bunch of people within legal scholarship who are starting kind of flipping legal scholarship on its head by, instead of like kind of doing the classic thing, which is to kind of identify a discrete legal problem and then identify as an expert, like here's the solution, to kind of, and to disavow by embracing the technocracy of law, kind of disavowing the politics of it, the struggle of it, the process by which things actually stay as they are, can change. And so in movement law, which is kind of what we're dubbing this thing, where scholars in legal scholarship, legal scholars are kind of starting with looking at grassroots militancy and organizing and ways that people are coming together, and then thinking alongside and kind of in relation to those experiments and campaigns as a way to, kind of just engage, build the space that those ideological and material contestations are taking up and try to build towards alternatives. And I think what it does is, what it does is It broadens, participates in broadening horizons for social change projects. It deepens critiques of law and the state. It expands theory ideas of how social change happens, which in liberal discourse and legal discourse is very narrow and elite, and also ignores histories of resistance. And by investing you in a solidarity practice, including through your scholarship with movements and organizing, it kind of tries to root you in a kind of collective practice rather than one that is all about individual and individual rent seeking in the way that Professor Ransby was suggesting, in the way that we're all kind of incentivized within our institutions.
Great, this is excellent. Okay, so I'm gonna go to a few questions that have been direct messaged to me now that we have 14 minutes left in the session. So this is I think a question that a number of people in our audience have had, and it's for those who perhaps don't have some of the background that you all have, who are moved and want to show up in a different way, where they are right now in their institutions, and want to incorporate movement work into their teaching or into their learning. And I think are looking for suggestions that you would have for somebody who is just getting started, who recognizes that this is something that they have not perhaps engaged with before, but want to do better moving forwards. So are there any types of suggestions that you might have for those looking for like where to hook in? This is open to the panel.
Well, I mean, I think, it depends on what situation the person's in, but finding community is really important because you get socialized, and sometimes you could be isolated at the early stages of your career, and you're told so many hoops you have to jump through. You're like, well, hey, if I want to keep a job, maybe I have to do this. Do I have to do this? What can I? And so I think we need community that validates that, the way that we see the world and the way that we want to map our contribution to the world is just and good and legit, and we can defend it. So I think finding community is important. I neglected to say this before, and this is a slight plug, but maybe it is partly an answer too, which is that we've just launched this thing called the Portal Project, which is the social justice portal project. It's borrowed from a quote by Arundhati Roy about pandemic as portal, and it's really trying to involve activists, artists, and scholars in a 2-year process of asking big questions. And we want to be very open and engaging. I mean, some of the conversations will be, very focused conversations, so they're not public, but we will be having public events and so forth. And people can find out more about it on sji.uic.edu. But there are many projects like that, webinars. Scholars for Social Justice certainly has an open door to people who want to collaborate. The Visualizing Abolition was a wonderful series that Gina Dent did at UC Santa Cruz that I think is now online somewhere. But I mean, there are resources, but then resources lead you to people, and people, even if it's not at your institution, finding your people who help you strategize and navigate a principled path in what is often an unprincipled professional culture is really important.
Really briefly, I mean, I think one is to recognize, like, building anything else into your teaching or scholarship, it takes time and homework and dedication and making a commitment. It's not, it's something to take seriously and important to do. The two things I would suggest in terms of where to start, one, I think, and this is hard and it'll take time, but I think it's important to identify what are the social movement organizations in your ecosystem and start to join an organization, go to meetings, figure out how you can be useful, and just go and listen and learn as a starting point. I think that, like, we should all be doing that, not just as scholars and intellectuals, but also just as people in this world. And the second piece is that partly because the left movement ecosystem has grown so quickly in the last decade, I think no matter what you teach, you will find movement materials and related campaigns. There's all sorts of toolkits and webinars and, and like scholars writing adjacent to those. And so I think one easy thing that anyone can do really is just to kind of spend some time looking online and talking to other friends who either organize or study in the area to kind of replace. So for example, when I taught my law and social movements class this semester, I can't remember what I had been using in prior semester to teach about race and capitalism, but this year what I did is I found this I think Dean Spade posted online a racial capitalism zine that was created by some activist collective. It's a comic. I used that. My students loved it, and also got a sense of, kind of gave them a sense of the kinds of materials that movement organizations are creating. And then I used, on teaching abolition, I used a recent critical resistance toolkit on police abolition. So there's all sorts of materials that are out there that you could sub in or complement with kind of the scholarly or other kinds of materials you normally might be using if you're not taking like a more movement approach yet.
Great. I'm going to come in and ask. I see one of my colleagues, Latasha Levy, here, who's asked this, I think, really interesting question. So I'm going to pose it to the panel here and then head to our closing question. And so I'm just going to read the question. How do we teach about the real conflicts and controversy, especially in this current moment around Black Lives Matter? From the beginning, there's been much competition, conflict, and class concerns, and social media activism popularity poses some real challenges. It's been easier to explore conflict and competition between groups and leaders in the past. How do we approach it in our contemporary struggles? Many times I feel like people aren't being honest, and there's legitimate fear about how these conflicts might be exploited by the state if we deal with them openly and honestly. Yes, Latasha, I'm gonna follow up with you later, but I won't want to open this.
Well, I'll just say, I don't teach movement conflicts. I don't go into the detail about movement internal struggles in my classroom necessarily, or in print. I think there is a such thing as principled struggle if you're in relationship with folks, that we're figuring out the best way to follow a principled path. Then there's things that happen that I feel are not principled, and that as a matter of integrity, you have to call them out, but that is not the first recourse. But I don't think you necessarily dissect ongoing internal struggles in a classroom setting. I think there's some discretion about that. But I wrote a book about the internal dynamics and politics of Movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, which talks about different factions and different players and individuals and all that. And I thought at each chapter, like, what is useful? What does a public audience need to know? What is going to be misleading? How many details do you reveal? Because I was also sort of a participant observer. So how many details do you reveal that then, may actually undo your purpose or undermine your purpose? So, so I think it's not a question of revealing every day. I write biographies too. I don't reveal every detail about a person's life. That's not necessarily getting us to a larger truth or a contradiction or a disagreement that we need to resolve. So I think it's a matter also of time and place for struggle, and discretion, but also honesty and truth telling.
I think a big part here is what's the purpose that we are looking at this material. I actually find studying the internal conflicts of past movements really important and instructive, because I actually see those conflicts coming up again, and because we've never engaged in honest conversation about the dynamics of trying to have an intersectional movement, whether that's class, gender, multiracial movements, the impacts of capitalism. And the truth of the matter is we've all been raised in a punitive system. And as a result, in many ways, because we're trained that way, we act punitively with each other. And the internet is really just another evolution of an opportunity to perpetuate those punitive ways of being upon each other. And, from a RJTJ, restorative justice, transformative justice perspective, most of us actually need to do the work of unlearning punitive systems. Even those of us in movements, even those of us who talk about abolition, even those of us who talk about and teach RJTJ need to be actively practicing this. And I think of myself as an educator as wanting to practice this also in the classroom, practice this in community, because just to be frank, like as being a part of movements, if we can't learn how to do things differently each time, our movements will swallow us. And we see this now in the current Black Lives Matter movement, where our trans loved ones are telling us you can't have Black liberation without trans liberation, which is 1,000,000% true. And to be quite frank, Stonewall was led by trans members of our community pushing back against police violence, and is foundational. But oftentimes we want to remember that moment not holistically and miss that there are foundations that have actually brought us to where we are. I think that it's actually really important that when we approach things from an academic perspective, when we're talking about movements, we also remember that these are relational things. These are relationships, and we need to be doing the work of repair. We can't simply study them from outside them and think that that won't have an impact in our classroom, because the personal is political and the political is personal. And so I really try to think about, how am I setting up the learning community we're having, where we can have an honest conversation, where there's also space to say if something hurts, and then create space to sort through that in the classroom. And to be honest, that actually doesn't fit with our time efficient, grade efficient, academic efficient goals, and certainly not in a law school. I actually found my law students more uncomfortable with me making space for us to talk about issues than if I would just speed bump them and keep going, but the hurt would still be there. And I think my students would have actually left our class worse off rather than better off if I hadn't been able or tried to make space in class to be about the relationships. Abolition is ultimately about the quality of relationships we can create. We won't get to a world beyond prisons and police if we can't figure out how to have more restorative and transformative ways of dealing with harm. That starts on the interpersonal level, and I think that's included in our classrooms. Now, do I think all classrooms or learning environments need to function like that? No, but I do think in a space where we're openly engaging a new way of being in society, we have to model that in our space, our learning space together.
Thank you so much for that. We have 3 minutes left, so I'm gonna do a lightning round. Somehow this time has gone by. And I want to take you all out to dinner, but we are in a pandemic world, so that's not going to happen until later on.
There's no dinner?
But in the future, I'm going to invite you back, all back, and we will do it proper. My final question here is, if you can lift up, who is someone that you continue to learn from? 1 minute max on this. Can I do Amna, Barbara, Nikkita?
There's so many people I could say here. I mean, I'll say two very briefly. One is that in general, I find young people, I'm always learning from them, including local organizers who've been organizing the Cops Off Campus campaign. So on campus at Ohio State, Roya Higazi and Destiny Brown. And then we also have a campaign to get cops out of schools from the public schools, and those organizers I've also been inspired by. And then someone who I've known a little bit longer, who I'm always inspired by and learning with and from, is Derica Purnell, who I know probably most of our audience knows because she's, like everyone knows Derica now, but Derica and her curiosity and her intellectual and commitments to both intellectual rigor and studying of past movements and struggle right now is really something that continues to inspire me every day.
Real quick, I guess I would say James Baldwin, I go back to time and again, and that message about demanding the impossible. I think in this moment that is our charge. And, just a myriad of other people, formerly incarcerated folks who maintained, through all kinds of assaults on their humanity and came out fighting and came out whole. I just have so much respect. So Albert Woodfox is one that comes to mind. That's where I'll leave it.
I would say from like the OGs in community who have been organizing for 40 some years and somehow are still in the fight. Young people, obviously, because they keep me honest. And like Professor Ransby, our currently incarcerated loved ones. I really get, I have the opportunity to spend time on phone or in other digital ways talking with members of the Black Prisoners Caucus here in Washington State and other folks who are in right now. And some of them are the best legal scholars and abolitionists I know. And I really appreciate that they take the time to teach me.
Great, thank you so much. With that, this concludes the WISIR webinar series. I am just so in gratitude to our three panelists. Thank you for being such lights. I want to just encourage the audience to get involved and or to learn more, either reading of all of their work. There's websites that I found that I was trying to figure out how to share, but I can't figure out how to share, but easily accessible online to learn about creative justice, to learn about movement law, to learn about Scholars for Social Justice and the Portals Project, to read about Ella Baker. So just really want to encourage everyone, and thank you so much for being with us on this journey of learning. All right, that's it. Bye.